Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Madison, and in this session, we're going to be chatting about writing clean, secure, and performant code, also known as doing code review. If you don't know me, I'm a senior manager on Acquia's professional services team. I'm based in Seattle. I've been doing Drupal for something like 12 years at this point. I started in Drupal 6. Uh, I am also the technical lead for Drupal GovCon, so I lead our web team. And if you read any of my blog material, or if you've seen me speak before, I tend to use the GovCon site as an example, and I will be doing so again today. We'll be getting into some of the code and work that we've done as part of this talk. So if you've not had a chance to see that before, we're gonna dig into some of that here today. Our agenda for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about some different tools and technologies that I recommend that you use and integrate into your project. We'll talk about some best practices, specifically around code quality. We're also going to get into some different analysis that you can do related to security and performance. This is not a security deep dive. If you want to know more about security in particular, my colleague Beverly Lanning is doing a talk on Friday in the first time slot, so 11 a.m. Eastern, about securing your Drupal application. So if you're more interested in security, go see Beverly talk on Friday. And we'll also just cover some common problems and examples throughout the talk. So let's start right off and talk about coding standards. This is something I'm pretty passionate about, and it's something I talk and blog about a lot. Because at the end of the day, coding standards, in my opinion, are one of the easiest things you can do on your project to try and simplify these three things, or to make these things more likely to happen, right? First and foremost, by having a standard approach to development, all of the developers, whether that's just you or you and 14 of your closest colleagues, I don't know how big of a team you have, but you know, the teams vary in size, obviously. The more you can standardize the way you write code, and the more you can write code the same way as your colleagues, the easier it's going to be to read the history, go through and look at the code, search and replace for problems as things get deprecated or refactored or whatnot. And it's also going to make it much easier to contribute to the code base, right? We'll talk more about that in a bit. Second, it makes the code much easier to manage. So, you know, as somebody who does code review all the time, I really like my developers to follow, you know, basically leave no trace principles. If you're an outdoorsy person, if you go hiking, if you go camping, you're probably familiar with leave no trace. And when it comes to coding, I like to talk about that as a approach as well, because, you know, if you're going in and making a small change over here, the only thing you should be changing is something over here. I shouldn't see a bunch of churn in, you know, 100 other files someplace else that you have unintended impact on. So the smallest possible impact that you can have. And then the last piece is making sure that your code can be easily and reliably tested. And again, if you have a bunch of different people writing their code in a bunch of different ways, or taking different approaches to how they're writing code, it becomes much more challenging and complex to actually automate or manually test the code base as a whole. So just something I blogged about actually last year. Essentially, if you have lower quality code or poor quality code, you're going to end up overcomplicating your platform. And at the end of the day, if you go off kind of on an island and do things your way or in a different way, if you go off and hire somebody who's a known Drupalist or a PHP expert, and you're doing things in a very different sort of way than is sort of the industry or the community standard, your team or your project or your module or whatever we're talking about here becomes that much harder for folks to come in and contribute to and become a part of, right? We want to have the easiest possible stepping stone onto your project and the easiest possible code to maintain, so that the folks that are working on it, and the folks that join your team, and the folks that contribute and collaborate with you have the easiest possible time collaborating and contributing. So first things first, when it comes to coding standards, it is almost impossible um, to do effective coding standards if you don't have these things. So first and foremost, you need to have a commonly agreed upon set of coding standards, and that may go without saying, but you know, that could be the Drupal community standards. So at Acquia, we have our own Acquia coding standards plugin for PHP Code Sniffer. It's based on Drupal Coder. It's based on the Drupal standards, but it's a little different, and that's what we use. At the end of the day, and I'll say this pretty plainly, it doesn't really matter. I don't really care what set of coding standards you follow, uh, as long as you have some that you follow and you agree on what they are. And you know, again, hopefully you're not reinventing the wheel here, because again, the PHP community, the Drupal community, there are well-established coding standards out there that you can pretty easily tag onto and consume without you having to like write all your own stuff. But pick something and agree on it. Next, whatever standards you agree on, you want to have some automated code scanning tools to enforce those standards. And so frequently, this is something that I catch people sort of not doing. So I can't tell you how many candidates to be an architect that I've interviewed, or organizations that I've gone in to work with, and I ask them, so what do you do for coding standards? And they're like, oh, I follow the Drupal community standards and we work to do blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, cool. So how do you enforce those? Oh, I just kind of look at the code. I just kind of read it to make sure that it's right. Yeah, that's not enforcing standards, right? Like, to enforce coding standards, you need to have a tool that goes through and actually scans for the right number of spaces, to make sure that you're using the right number of characters on a line, to make sure that you're not doing something silly like forgetting your comments, or you know, avoiding dependency injection, or any of these things that are part of the coding standards. Some of those are pretty obvious, you might notice. Some of those are less obvious, you might not. Use automated scanning tools. Next, set up continuous integration. In an ideal world, every single change you make to your code base, whether that is a composer update for Drupal core because there's a security vulnerability, or you know, one of the examples we're going to look at today, my colleague Tim put in a pull request for the GovCon site earlier this week. He made a very minor config change, or it's a more significant custom bit of PHP. Whatever you're doing, however you're doing it, anything that changes should run through CI. And as it's running through continuous integration, it should be getting coding standards run against it. And a coding standards violation should fail your build. And then finally, you should have some sort of code review methodology. Again, one of the things I see so frequently is, you know, something gets changed and it just immediately gets merged. I realize that not every organization has a big enough team to have a buddy system. So, you know, maybe you're going to end up doing code review on your own work. But ideally, even in a small team, couple of developers, 3-4 developers, if I'm doing work, you know, one of you should be reviewing my work. And you're not necessarily there to do a ton of critique per se, but again, if we have commonly agreed upon coding standards, you should be able to look at my work and give me feedback. And I just can't stress enough that if you are trying to do coding standards but not doing these things, you've got a pretty high chance of failure if the team isn't aligned. Again, we don't have a common definition of what we're trying to do. You haven't automated as much as possible those coding standards. Static code analysis will find things that the human eye does not. If you're not running CI and enforcing CI on every code change, right? If we're saying that, oh, we're going to run continuous integration some of the time, yeah, that's silly. You know, do it all the way. And again, manual intervention does need to be present to ensure that you're holding each other accountable. Can I give example links for coding standards and automated code scanning tools? Yes, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. So here are some examples, actually, hopefully to answer that question. So As a general rule, if you're working on a project, and most Drupal projects, by the way, are not just PHP projects, right? Drupal, just out of the box, is going to have JavaScript, PHP, Twig, and YAML and CSS in it. There's a reasonable chance as you do development, you may add some additional things as well. Composer as well. But as a general rule, if you're using a language, if you're using a technology like Composer, you should have some sort of coding standards validation for that technology or that language. So Composer ships with its own validation tool, right? So Composer Validate. If you try to run Composer install when your Composer JSON or Composer lock files are invalid, it's not going to work, right? You may get an immediate failure. You may get 3/4 of the way through and then have a failure, but it's going to fail. So, one of the very first things we do in all of our CI builds is run Composer Validate to make sure that the Composer files are valid. That fails the build, by the way, if they're not. For PHP, PHP Code Sniffer is kind of the industry standard for that. Grum PHP is also widely used and very good. There's also a project out on Drupal.org called Drupal Coder. It's not actually a module, but it is sort of the Drupal community standards for PHP Code Sniffer. So PHP Code Sniffer is what you should be using for your PHP code. For Twig, Symfony has a Twig linter that you can set up and use. And for YAML, my colleague Matthew Grasmick has a YAML CLI tool that you can use to validate your YAML. And again, you don't have to use these specifically. These are the ones we tend to use. If you're doing React or Angular or any other like ES6 JavaScript, if you're doing Sass, any of those additional sorts of languages in your code base, you should also be running code validation on all of those. Again, the general rule is if you're writing something in a language, you should be running something to make sure that you're writing it correctly. And remember, PHP rules do not apply to YAML. YAML rules do not apply to Sass. So I'm not saying you need to be an expert in what all of these different languages coding standards are, but you do need to have the automated tools in place so that if you are writing them improperly, it will catch them for you. Because I'll be the first to admit, like Sass and JavaScript best practices are not something that I am an expert in. I can look at the output from a linter though and figure out what the heck is wrong and fix it before I merge something that's going to break my code. Some other things that I recommend that you standardize, again, this is pretty low-hanging fruit. Make sure you have a really good and well thought out getignore file committed in the root of your project. It may sound silly, but having a bunch of different people committing different things in different places in different ways, again, really quick way to pollute the quality of your project, and it can cause pretty significant issues in maintaining a repository. Editor config. This is one that I had not used before, 4 or 5 years ago, but most modern IDEs and encoding tools can consume an editor config file. So just to quickly show you what that looks like, in an editor config, very simple, but it's basically just telling what the end of line character should be. Are we using tabs or spaces? What is the indent? So 2 spaces or the indent standard character set, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also can change the indent for specific files like composer.json and .lock. Again, the advantage of doing this is that everybody who uses this code base is going to get these exact same coding standards. And we want to make sure that, again, if I open something and am using 2 spaces and then you open it and you're using 4 spaces, I don't want every line of every file that we open to bounce back and forth between 2 and 4 spaces. If you are using dependency managers like Composer, NPM, Yarn, whatever, definitely commit the lock files. You want to make sure that everybody's using the exact same version of what you're using. And again, the best way to ensure that is to commit the lock file. Those lock files should only change when somebody intentionally runs an update. So, I've worked with folks before where the last step in their deployment is to run a composer update. No. If you're going to do an update, that should be the very first thing that happens. That should trigger CI. Everything should run through the build, test, code review, etc. Again, that lock file should never change unless you want it to change, and you are able to test that change. And then finally, again, config files for virtual environments. So if you're using Lando or Drupal VM or DDEV or Doxel or whatever you're using, you want to make sure that the config file is committed into the repository. Again, you should have your basically entire ecosystem configured to be standardized, so that everybody's doing the same thing, following the same process, and sort of working towards a common goal altogether. A few other things to consider on this front. Use an IDE if at all possible. I've talked about that before. I've blogged about that extensively. If you're doing PHP development in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, you really need to be using an IDE. If you are using IDEs, use the same IDEs as a team. So, if half of you are using VS Code and half of you are using PHP Storm, I don't know, arm wrestle, flip a coin, figure it out. Configuring your project to be a certain way is best, primarily because you can set up your debugger. You can make sure that if a behavior is happening for one of you, it will happen for all of you. Again, if you're using the same IDE, the same virtual machine, the same setup, that's much more likely to happen, etc. Document your team's processes. This includes the coding standards that you follow. So if I'm coming onto your project for the first time and I'm trying to write some code, and if I'm trying to do something to contribute, and everything that I do ends up having to be changed because I didn't follow the right coding standards, or I didn't use the right VM, or whatever, that can be really demoralizing to me. That can end up costing a lot of time and money. On and on and on down the list, right? So taking the time to really thoroughly document, hey, we follow these coding standards. Here are the tools that we use. Here's how you set up and run those tools as part of your development process to make sure that we're going to commit your code, et cetera, et cetera. Not only does that lower the bar to contribution, you're going to get higher quality contributions. You're going to get people that are more likely to contribute. If we're talking about an open source project or even on your own team, again, it's much better for team morale. And again, much more likely to get a high quality, good commit out of that individual the first time. And finally, if you are working with other vendors, contractors, partners, or even other teams in your organization, make sure you're all playing by the same rules. One of the most damaged code bases I've interacted with in my career was a scenario where there were 4 or 5 different teams all contributing into the same code base. None of them were using the same process. None of them were using the same coding standards. None of them were following the same procedures. And the end result was just hot garbage. There were 20,000 plus lines of output from PHP Code Sniffer of just poorly written code. You couldn't go in and do like a refactor on anything because, again, you had 5 different groups of people writing 5 different, very different approaches to the code. It ended up being I feel like I spent the better part of 3 to 6 months just trying to unravel and straighten out and standardize. And I would say that any one thread in that mess was fine, right? It wasn't that any one of those groups was doing something wrong and any one of them was doing it right. But I've learned the hard way that if you put 6 really smart people on a thing and ask all 6 of them to solve it, and you don't ask them to collaborate or deal with each other, there's a really good chance that the 6 of them are going to run in 6 totally different directions. And again, that's not to say that any one of them is right and any one of them is wrong, maybe. But more likely, without giving them guidance and without giving them that collaboration, you're going to just be, sort of running all over each other and just causing a real mess. So, having everybody playing by the same rules, having everybody march in the same direction, having everybody contribute in the same way Again, back to the original point I was making, it's going to make it a lot easier to maintain your code base, and you're going to end up with a higher quality product at the end of the day. So let's look at a quick example of perhaps some problematic code. Now, I'm going to just let you look at this for a moment. There is one thing in here that is not following coding standards. It's a minor thing, but it is a great example of where an automated scanning tool would come in handy, because if you really wanted to read through these 40 lines of code and find it, you might. Some of you may be spotting it, but if you're not, I'll point it out here in just a sec. So in this particular example, we're using two different declarations. So up here on line 98, we're doing what is, I would consider, the conventional Drupal standard at this point, which is just using the square brackets to define the array. And down here on line 124, you can see we're doing it more like the original old-fashioned way of actually writing out array and doing a parenthesis. Now, there's nothing wrong with writing out the word array. This works. PHP interprets this. This will run like this is a stylistic thing 100%. But if I wanted to go in and find all usages of this views, set arguments, whatever, depending on how I searched for that, if some instances were using array and some instances were using square brackets, I might very well miss out on some of the instances of this code. Yeah, this is a good example of a minor thing, a stylistic thing, but if we all agree that we're doing square brackets, you should not get this. So here's another quick example for you. Let's imagine that you are coming onto a project and I ask you to do some work with this function. And this is not a particularly long or complex function. If you have a look at it, it's less than 20 lines. You know, we could kind of read through this. We could kind of get an idea of like what's going on here. We can see that we're doing a query and we're loading some IDs and like there's some stuff going on. But let me ask you this, would you rather work with this function as you see it here, or would you rather work with the exact same function as you see it here? This function is now a few lines longer. Nothing fundamentally, actually there are no changes in the actual function itself, but you can see here we get a brief description of what it is. We actually define and type the parameters coming into the function, and we just mentioned what some of the throws are that Drupal itself would throw based on some of the methods that we're using in this function. Again, these are the exact same code. This is a much more welcoming and useful function though, even though it's the exact same code, because of these extra like 8 lines here at the top, or 10 lines at the top. And again, an automated code scanner will complain at you if you do this, because the code scanner, PHP code sniffer, is going to say, hey, hi, you forgot a document, you forgot a comment on this function. It's not going to ask you to do this. But again, if your coding standards as a team say, hey, y'all, we are going to define our params, we're going to put in throws. If there's a return, we want a return parameter, blah, 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 blah. Like if that is something that you all agree to do, again, you're going to make it that much easier to maintain this code. Because if this ever breaks, if something ever changes, anybody on your team can come in, look at this, figure out what's going on, and continue. And this level of documentation is like 30 seconds of work. I'm not asking you to write a book, but it does significantly lower the bar to contribution. All right, let's move on and talk about security. I'm very pleased that I was able to use this meme in this conversation. So we just talked a lot about automating things and trying to involve automation as much as possible. Unfortunately for security, and if anybody has something out there that is a terrific automated security scanner for Drupal, please put it in the chat. I have not come across um, anything that I would use on a regular basis. Now there are some tools like, Drush PM Security. There's a Composer Security Scanner that we'll talk about. But when it comes to doing security, the problem with security, and the reason it's so hard to do an automated tool, is that so much of what happens is based on the context in which you're doing whatever silly thing you're maybe doing in it. So it's really hard to have a hard and fast rule to say this is always secure, this is always insecure. Thank you, Jason. Some chat coming in now about some tools that might be good. There are a few things that you can reliably automate. So within code scanners themselves, NPM has built in the audit command, which will tell you if you have any dependencies. I believe Yarn has an equivalent. Drush has a PM security, which will flag if you have any outstanding or known insecure modules. Now, this does not find security vulnerabilities in the code. All it's doing is saying you're running version X, checking version X is insecure, you should be running version Y. So it's not a full-blown security audit, but it at least will tell you, hey, update your stuff. And then there's also a security check command from Enlighten Security Checker, which does the same thing with other composer packages. Drush is only going to check the Drupal modules. Security check will check all of your composer packages against, again, the same idea. Like, is there a known CVE out there for any of the packages that you're using? There are some Drupal tools that you can use that are really happy. The bottom three here are modules. Actually, all four of these are modules. There's the core update module, basically does the same thing as Drush PM Security. Fair warning, having the update module on can impact your performance. Personally, I think that performance impact is worthwhile. It may not be in your circumstance. There are also modules called Site Audit, Security Review, and Hacked. Again, these are not going to get down to the level of telling you if you're doing something stupid in your PHP, but these are going to tell you, have you altered Drupal core or altered a module? Do you have views that aren't following best standards? Do you have, are you letting people upload JavaScript files? There's a bunch of those different things that these modules will do. Again, I would consider those fairly low level or low hanging fruit, but you can still get a site hacked because of low hanging fruit, right? Like if you allow people to upload JavaScript and they're doing silly things with it, yeah, you can still lose a website because of something small. So these are not bad tools to use periodically. Let's talk about some common indicators. And again, these are things that I look for when I'm doing code review. The nice thing about doing a security review or a security audit is it is a relatively small subset of all of the potential things that could be wrong with code. There could be something that is stylistically terrible, but in fact is very secure. And at the same token, there could be something that is very insecure, but is stylistically acceptable. So just don't conflate what we were talking about a moment ago with coding standards and what we're talking about now with security. And this is one of the things as I work with folks on my team who are learning about doing security audits or wanting to learn more about security best practices, you really have to train your brain to stop doing this broad sweep of all the stuff and really narrow the focus down. Because when you're looking at security, there really are only a pretty small number of things that you can do to a Drupal application to screw it up. There's a lot of variation on how you can do those things, and there's a very wide application of the impact of those things. But doing a review for code standards and quality is typically a much bigger undertaking than doing a security audit. And some of those common indicators are looking for things like custom routes with parameters, improperly checking for access, a real common thing, especially on custom routes, custom views, just granting access immediately to it. Debugging code left in the module, queries that are not checking for user input, using the raw filter in Twig. And there's a pretty good page out on Drupal.org that will actually check for, that will, give you more information. Another really common one that I guess I didn't put on the list here, but believe it or not, some of the most offensive things I found in Drupal code bases are frequently surrounding the WYSIWYG. I see people set up their WYSIWYG editor to basically allow any HTML tags. You end up with people putting script tags directly in the WYSIWYG, sometimes intentionally, because I don't know, they're doing JavaScript inside CK editor for whatever reason, or worse, inadvertently, right? You copy and paste text off of some other web page, you grab a script tag inadvertently, now you have somebody else's scripting running on your site and you didn't know it. Embed, iframe, some of those really simple HTML tags that have been around as long as some of us have been alive can end up really, really exposing your site, particularly to cross-site scripting or cross-site forgery sorts of situations. So that's the sort of thing, again, that has nothing to do with PHP. That's not even something you'd see in PHP. That's something that's in your Drupal config and ultimately in your content. So, again, a lot of what you need to do when you're doing a security review or making sure that you're writing secure code is looking at how have we configured things, how are we accessing things, who can get access to what, and what have we done. So some examples here, in this case, this is the exact same route. This first one you can see just grants access true. There is no check on this at all, so everybody can get to this. In this second example, we're passing a permission for the requirement to say access content. Now you might be saying, hey, Mike, on our website, anonymous users can access content. So that means anybody can get to it, and that's fair. Let me give you a real world scenario though. Let's imagine that we realize that this advanced hello page needs to come down. And because it needs to come down, we're gonna quickly go and change anonymous users so they can no longer access content. Well, in this case, this route, since it isn't checking for a permission, I would actually have to alter this code and deploy a change all the way through production to remove access to this route. This one, since it's checking that access content permission, if I pull the access content permission, it will immediately take away access to this route to everybody who doesn't have access to content. So, again, as a best practice, you should never, ever, 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 ever blindly grant access to somebody or something. You should always at minimum have a permission, and feel free to use an out-of-the-box Drupal permission like access content. You don't have to roll your own. Question in chat from Ryan, is there a tool to check site configs like CK editor, HTML filters, or SMTP settings, etc.? Again, not that I'm aware of. That's just something that as part of my manual code review, I keep an eye on. I suppose there are perfectly valid reasons why you might want to put a script tag into a WYSIWYG, but it's a great example of if you do it in the right situation and everything is fine, it's fine until it's not fine because somebody took advantage of it or you had an accident or whatever, right? Like script tags, like writing JavaScript inside CK editors, just I think generally a bad practice, right? You shouldn't be writing JavaScript in WYSIWYG. So to the best of my knowledge, no, there's not something that's going to complain at you for that, which is why one of the things that it's part of the reason I bring it up here, because it is a super common thing. Getting away from routes. So this is a YAML example. This is a PHP example of the same thing. So in this case, we have a block access function. And you can see that it's returning access result is allowed. Again, this basically means that this block is always accessible. Whereas in this case, instead of returning access result allowed, we're returning access result allowed if has permission, the account in question, and then access content. Very subtle difference between the two. This is much, much more secure and a better practice. So some security best practices, just to call out generally, make sure you're deploying security updates ASAP, ideally within 24 hours if that CVE is a 20 or higher in severity. Avoid changing anything directly in production. So that means, you should not have a PHP filter. You should not have the embedded JavaScript or anything directly in your WYSIWYG. There it is. Passwords, API keys should never live in your config or your code base. Ideally, you would use like a platform secrets file to store any of those API keys and passwords. Again, this is not something that you're necessarily going to find in a scanner, but I watch for like a hawk. Anytime I see a code or a pull request get open, I'm making sure there's no API keys or passwords or anything. Make sure you're not giving too many people super admin privileges. Try not to let people use the root Drupal login for user one. And if they have to use it, make sure they're logging in via Drush, not via credentials. Make sure all of your accounts are using TFA, password policies, single sign-on, whatever. And this last one may be a little controversial, but don't write custom code if you don't have to, right? A lot of security vulnerabilities come about because you're doing things in code that could be done through Drupal core or contrib modules. So the more custom code you write, the more custom code you have to maintain and secure and audit and review. So my litmus test is always, is custom code the best way to do this? And the answer is not always yes. Let's talk about performance. Now, the good news is you can automate for performance testing a little bit, but it's a very different angle than what we were just talking about. You still need to be doing code review and reading for really silly things, but automating your performance testing is really like load testing, right? Like throwing a load at a particular page to make sure that the content, the custom code, and the hardware and the caching and all that stuff is fired up and working. You can use things like Chrome Lighthouse to do a performance test on your page. That's great. There are also some best practices you can follow with performance. But again, at the end of the day, for performance, what you really need to do is read the code, right? One of the most common things that I see that tanks performance is loops within loops. So we're going to do a big query to get a bunch of content, taxonomy terms, nodes, whatever. We're going to load one. Then we're going to load more stuff. So we're going to do a loop, a load, a loop, a load. So we're doing this big perpetual motion through the code. And sometimes you end up with thousands and thousands and thousands of entity queries happening on a page or in a function or whatnot. Because when you wrote it, you only had one or two pieces of test content. Now, a year and a half later, we're in production and we have 30,000 paragraphs and we need to loop through everything on a piece of page, whatever it is, right? So, looking for things like that. Again, context, an entity load, a loop, a query, none of those things by themselves are inherently bad, but they are definitely problematic in the right set of circumstances. So just be smart about what you're doing, pay attention to what you're writing, and remember that if you are writing custom code, think about the scalability of that code. If it works fine with one or two things, is it going to work fine with 1 or 200 things or 1 or 2,000 things? And the answer there may be no. I also want to remind you that with performance issues often cluster. And what I mean by that is if you're having a performance issue, you may not have one big performance problem. You may have a whole bunch of little performance problems that have manifested as one big performance problem. I worked with a customer some years back, and their search page was taking something like 18 seconds to load. And, I think we found 6 or 8 different problems, and we'd fix one and get it out of the way, which would cause another one to bubble up, using New Relic, and we'd fix that one and get it out of the way, and then we'd find another one, and we'd sort of traverse down to the point where without changing hardware, without changing caching, nothing really significant changed other than fixing problems in the code. We took that page from 18 seconds down to 2 seconds. And it was not one big problem. Like I said, it was a lot of little problems. So keeping an eye out for performance indicators, again, as we talked about, making sure that there's image styles, making sure that your views aren't loading too many things, all of these little pieces as you build and as you code review can really pay off big on the other end. Code review. Manual code review, as I was just saying, really needs to be part of what you're doing. Right? And if you don't have anybody on your team familiar with security and performance best practices, that's something you should consider investing in. You know, if that doesn't mean you need to go hire somebody, that doesn't mean you need to go bring in a vendor, but you know, if you have folks on your team and nobody knows anything about security and the stuff that we're talking about here, somebody should invest some time and energy into researching this topic and learning about it, right? Experts are made over time, and you too can become an expert in these things. It takes time. And if you're writing custom code for Drupal, Performant Code, Secure Code, and Clean Code are all really excellent things to invest some time and energy in. Shalane's asking, what about PHP mess detector? I'm not familiar with that one. You could certainly, sure, if you can automate it and run it. Like I said earlier, I do not have any firm attachment to any one thing. I personally use, like I said, Code Sniffer, but as long as you can automate your standards and it gives you back consistent results, I'd say go for it. All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm not going to dig into the code a ton here. In fact, we've already looked at a few things. If you're not familiar with the GovCon repo, check it out. You can see here how we've integrated code sniffing, security testing, all the stuff that we've been talking about today in our CI processes. This is an open source project, open source repo, so please do check it out. You can clone the code, set up our VM, install it, everything. Hopefully give you some good stuff to take away from this call today. 3 big takeaways. Again, you should always review code, automate everything you can, but manual review and intervention are still critical. Make sure that when you're doing your security auditing that you do remember the breadth of a security audit is much smaller than the breadth of everything you could possibly audit in the world. And remember, to really accurately performance test something, you need content and appropriate hardware and load. And if you're trying to do performance testing without those things, you're not going to get accurate results. With that, I think we can probably wrap up. I do just want to mention, if you enjoyed this talk, I'm doing a couple of other sessions this week, talking about DevOps technologies tomorrow, Drupal 8 end of life tomorrow, and then I'm with my colleague Ron going to be talking about Acquia Lightning end of life. So if you're using Lightning, this would be a great session for you. But yeah, what questions do you all have about what we talked about here today? Thank you for joining. Do I have thoughts on PHP strict types equals 1? No, I don't. Again, like I said at the beginning, to me, the most important thing is you and your team agree on what you want to follow and that you can automate a way to test it. So as long as you all are comfortable with that, then I do not have an opinion. And yes, I will upload my slides. I'm not sure if we're doing that through Hopin this year or how we're doing it, but yes, I will post my slides. Any other questions? Do I have suggestions for dealing with more human aspects of those stubborn developers, peers who refuse to change their ways, et cetera, dismiss your concerns? You know, I think, and that's a great question, Max. So, you know, the human element of this is a really challenging one. And, you know, on the one end of the spectrum, hopefully you can be rational and explain to them the benefits of code quality and coding standards. And on the other end, instead of using sort of the carrot, you can use the stick, right? You can get more senior management involved. You can, you know, sort of more lay down the law and say, look, this is how we're going to be doing this. And if you're going to be working on this project, this is sort of how you need to do it. Automating is a big part of that, right? Because if you have to open a pull request, and that pull request has to run CI, and if CI has to validate code standards, and code standards will cause the build to fail, we're at a point where that person cannot contribute to the project if their coding sucks, right? And hopefully, like I said, we can start on the other end. We can start on the other end and more do the human factor as opposed to the stick. But I find that automating things and defining those in an automated fashion actually depersonalizes it a little bit, right? This isn't me beating you up. These are the standards we're using, and your code doesn't pass these standards, and I'm not going to merge your code until they do. Um, Most people do eventually buckle under that pressure. If your entire team is revolting against you, that is a challenge. And at that point, I think you need to have the conversation of what are they willing to do and what can they do. Um, Typically though, like, this is not hard, right? Like, changing the way you code and writing with standards is a behavior change, but it is not a significant behavior change. Joel asks best practices for disabling user one. Typically what I do is not actually disable it. I just use LastPass or a password generator. I will set the username to like a 20+ character randomized string, set the password to a different 20+ character randomized string, and then nobody has the credentials for user one. It's still there, it's still active, you can drush into it, but you cannot access it without drush. I believe you can actually go in and block user one through the user interface. But if you do that, you essentially have to set up other administrative accounts, and you kind of replicate the problem with user one if you do that. So my advice is not to actually disable user one. It's just to not let anybody directly access user one unless they can drush into the site. What do I recommend as some ways to load test Drupal sites? We use JMeter. You basically put your site out there, you get your content published, and use JMeter to write scenarios. You can use your Google Analytics to essentially figure out how much traffic is expected. JMeter can then throw load at the server. And again, you need to have production sized hardware to get an accurate test. You need to have realistic content, feature complete code, et cetera, et cetera. But JMeter can then throw the load at the server and essentially tell you, the results of that test can tell you, as the load goes up, how does your performance scale? How long does it take? If we have X number of sessions, how long does it take for the page to load? And then you can make decisions, is that fast enough? And if not, then you have to start thinking about, well, do we need to upsize our hardware? Is our code efficient, et cetera, et cetera. Sylvia asks, can Chrome Lighthouse check your website performance even though it's in staging and not published? So yes and no. That's a good question, Sylvia. So what Chrome is going to do is Chrome is going to watch using the network tab, basically, what is loading, how long is it taking, etc. And you may have noticed, let me go back in my slides here. This does not give us a score based on any loading metric, right? This is just, it's basically telling us how long this takes based on what's happening on the page. And this one was in production. So this is not taking into consideration the same thing that a load test would take into consideration, right? This is one session. That's really useful data. You'd be surprised what you can find with a single session. Throwing 10,000 concurrent sessions at a page is going to give you a very different picture of how your site performs. This though is really useful. Like I did an audit for a customer some time back, and I discovered that their carousel on the homepage was loading like 70, 80 megabytes worth of data on the homepage, because they were doing a like 900 pixel wide carousel, and all of the images going into that carousel were like 3,500 to 4,500 pixels. So they were 3 or 4 times bigger than they should have been. They had not been compressed at all. So every one of those images was like 7 or 8 megabytes, and there were like 10 of them. Right. So again, Chrome is going to help you find stupid things like that, where it's like, oh my God, this homepage is taking 14 seconds to load. And if you look at what's going on, it's because blah, 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 right? Like the images are huge. This is a problem. This is a problem. This is a problem. That's very different than how does my site scale under load. But yeah, Chrome is great as long as you can you can even do this on a local, and it'll give you a performance score based on what's loading and how it's loading. And Ray just said you can also run Lighthouse offline via the command line. Thanks, that's a useful tip. Vinay asks, is there a way to detect unused CSS and JavaScript on a Drupal website? I don't know of a way to do that. I mean, it may be possible. I do not know off the top of my head if there is a way to do that through the libraries API or anything else. You could potentially, again, if when looking at your code, If you get down into like your Drupal theme layer and you go into your library definition, and you've got the different libraries, theoretically you should be able to search through your code to see, oh, are we using font awesome anymore? I don't know. Are we, you could do something like that, but I don't know of a way to automatically detect it. Ryan just posted that Google Chrome has some tool that you can install to do unused CSS. So that might help you. I don't think there's a way in Drupal itself to do it. These are great questions, everybody. I want to be respectful to the next presenter. I think we have a break coming up after this, but I do want to wrap it up here soon. Do we have any other questions? What criteria do I use for custom code? Could you expand on that, Bernardo? What do you mean by what criteria? Like, how do I decide if I should write custom code? Yeah, so the first question is there anything out of the box with Drupal core or anything from the community that I can use? And if the answer is no, the next question is, well, is there something close to what I want that is well maintained? The answer to that is sometimes also no. And the last question I ask is, if we write this as wholly custom code, or even if we extend something from Drupal core, or instantiate something that exists and customize it, do we, or more realistically, do our customers have the technical skills to maintain that thing? Right? Because if we, say Acquia Professional Services, goes into a customer and builds them this really complex and challenging thing that does everything that they want, and then we hand it to them, if I go and give all of you Formula One cars, but none of you know how to drive a Formula One car, I may have given you what you wanted, but if you crash in turn one, I'm not actually doing you any favors. I might actually have done significant damage to you in the process, right? So is there a better alternative? The first two things. If there's not a better alternative, is the custom code something that can be maintained, can be safely implemented, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? If the answer to that last bit is yes, then cool, let's build it. If the answer to that is no, then I actually have a pretty frank conversation with my customer and say, hey, look, like, we can build this. This is going to be fairly complex to build. It's going to be very complex to maintain. Are you willing to take on the ownership of this thing? Do you want to open source it so other people can use it? Do you want to keep it closed and internal? Like, there's sort of this decision tree that you have to go down. And at the end of the day, as long as it can be safely maintained, I'm not opposed to doing custom code. Keep in mind too, just to further elaborate, like, if you look at custom code, like a lot of the modules we've built on the GovCon site, a lot of what we've done here are instantiating plugins for views or blocks. We've done some form alters or theme functions. Like, this level of custom code is not particularly dangerous, right? Because this is super basic Drupal stuff. Like, this is not something that is likely to become wildly insecure in the future, right? We're not really building anything significantly complex here. On the other hand, if you're going out and building custom entities, if you're doing a bunch of really more challenging custom code that is not just sort of taking something, then it gets significantly harder to build. Do you know how most Drupal core and/or contributed vulnerabilities are found? Yeah, actually, it's by people like you and me who are using the module and notice something on just about every. 1 second. Let's see. So just for instance, I'm going to pull up the upgrade status module because it's the one I have. There is a link over here to report a security vulnerability. And this will actually open a special issue that is not part of the normal issue queue. It goes into the security team's issue queue. And then you can work with the security team and the module maintainer to determine a remediation for that issue. But almost all Drupal core and Drupal contributed vulnerabilities are found by folks like you and me who are using the projects and discover something and report it. Every now and again, an organization will, and this gets to your second question, is it usually a manual process? There are organizations out there that will hire third parties to do penetration testing or security audits or things like that. So some of the really big CVEs that came out, I think last year, Don't quote me on this, but either 2019 or 2020, somebody did that. Somebody did a big audit of Drupal and they found a couple of things. But yes, it is usually a manual process. I actually asked the security team at DrupalCon this year if they had done any, really significant security audits recently, and the answer was no. So yeah, it's almost all manually found and reported by folks in the community, just like most open source projects. And John just linked to a book in chat called The Drupal Way from O'Reilly. Thanks for that, John. There's still quite a few of you here. Any other questions? I appreciate you all hanging out into the break. Well, hey, for those of you that are still here, thank you. If you haven't already, hit me up on Twitter, hit me up on LinkedIn. I do pretty actively blog. Definitely want to connect with you. And as I said, I have several other sessions going on this week, so hope to see some of you again. Enjoy GovCon. I'm sad we're not all together at NIH this year, but better safe than sorry. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.